Hello, Paul Mordetsky in Hightstown, New Jersey with installment number 3 of our 5-part video series on drawing the head. Today's focus will be about the order of light, the value scale which we use to notate that order, and on the block-in, a simplified schema of light and shadow shapes that help us see the entire pattern and set us up for a more detailed tonal rendering. Let's take a look. We're going to work on using the same reference I've been using the last couple of drawings for a couple of reasons. I'm liking this photo. The more I work on it, the more I see errors that I made and calculations that were off. And so I'm having a really good time kind of figuring it out and learning and inspecting this image of myself. And I think I may end up just using it for something else. So this is a nice kind of exploration for me at the same time that I'm exploring things for you. Now, to save some time, I've done a mapping and measuring drawing. I've gone from pure lines and positions and that kind of stuff into beginnings of shape. But remember still that mapping and measuring part is about this angle versus this angle versus this. It's not about the shapes. It's about movements in space and positions and references. So once we've gotten that to the point where we feel that we can trust it, or we're so thoroughly sick of doing that, we move on to making those into the shapes that we see. So we begin to close them out, and we begin to say that this shape connects to this line connects to this one, and connects to that one, and connects to this one, and connects, and we begin to carve out shapes. That will ultimately enable us to put tones into those shapes. It's the order of the tones, the order of the grays from white down to black, that will enable us to create the illusion of light on a form. In order to understand how to do that, we need to consider the grayscale, and we need to consider what is called the order of light. Sometimes known as the classical order of light. So let's talk about this with this diagrammatic drawing that shows us a single source of light, that the light is coming straight at an object. It goes straight like this, it goes straight like that. It's moving off straight in all these different directions from that one source. And you could kind of almost imagine that there's a curve here, and that as it moves away from that center direction, the light is getting weaker as it goes like that. As we encounter this curved form, the light is most intense where it's most direct, and then as this form turns, and as it turns, the light will be weaker because the angle to it is more acute, and this, it hits the light, it hits the surface much more obliquely. So we want to think about a perpendicular line that goes across like that, and that gives us the point where the light cannot get down here. So this form is turning, and at its fattest point, the light is simply going to pass it, and it's not going to get into this lower part. So we could just imagine that this part is all in shadow. That light this ball will also get in the way of the light, creating a cast shadow. This all has parts. Cast shadow is the shadow cast by an object. The dark side is called the form shadow. The place where the line where the light stops, let's see where I can write that, is called the terminator. It's the end of the light. Terminator. And that direction and this point are called the poles. The place where the light hits most, which would be up here, is called the center light. And as that light gets down here, it's a little bit darker, and that's called the halftone. So we have a shadow, a halftone, or what's known as the dark light. I like that term because it's really expressive of what's going on. And then we have the cast shadow. The cast shadow is always darker than the form shadow. And there's one other element that we'll talk about more later, but at some point the light may bounce up into the bottom of this and make it a little bit lighter down here. That's called reflected light shadow. We'll go through more of that as we go along because we need to talk about it in here. Now, that's a diagram. On a ball, you cannot have a straight line because it's a ball. That line has to curve. So the terminator curves or moves with whatever shape it's on. So what happens here? So let's kind of go with the same idea that we have a terminator and some kind of cast shadow, a relationship like that. And now let's imagine that we're making some kind of shape like that to follow the surface of the ball across. So that would be like this, but in here. And we're doing the same thing here. And so at one point we would find that, and then we go up to the terminators, and we get this curved shape. Now, I'm just making that up based on, a rational, logical progression, but when you look at something, you'll see it. When you're looking at a ball and it's in a particular light, you will have to put together that curve expressive of like a cross section of that ball. We're only seeing this part, and then it comes down to here. The shadow itself, the cast shadow, it depends on the direction of the light and all that, but that will come from this little skinny part here and out. So that terminator, we really want to be a very skinny, thin line, because it doesn't really exist. It's more theoretical than physical. There's no line there. It's just that the light disappears at that point. So it's a kind of an edge. And, it's getting darker, 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 darker. And at this point, it just kind of winks out. What we want to do now in terms of understanding this is to put in a tone that represents the form shadow, the side of that ball, that white ball that is not lit. And we would do the same thing down here. So it's a thin layer of gray, and we'll get to it in a minute, but we want to think about it as value 5, kind of like right more or less in between white and black. It could be a little lighter than that. Now, I've been going over this paper a lot, and it's actually just cheap copy paper, so it's getting very, very funky and grainy. Copy paper is not great to draw on, so I need to just come in there. I want to get rid of that line that separates the ball from the shadow, because we want to think about the world of light, the world of shadow. Eventually, we're going to think about it within an entire frame, but that might be a little confusing at this point. And that's really what we're looking for when we're going to color this guy in. We want to separate the light, we want to draw accurately the light shape and the dark shape and separate them into these two worlds and look for a big pattern. We could push it a little further by adding another gray. And another gray. And that's probably it. And we would clean out this area. We want to see it as completely white. And we want to make sure that the white shape is correct. We want to make sure that the dark shape is correct. And reach over here and get a brush so I can clean that out. When we have a reflected light shadow, and we have an area where the shadow gets lighter, that leaves us with two parts to the shadow, a darker part and a more lit part. The more lit part, which is still in the shadow and still darker than anything here, is called, as I said, the reflected light shadow. And this darker part is called the core shadow or the form shadow. It doesn't really matter, you know. This is making this look darker. That's it. And the only other part of the shadow shapes that we might have, which we don't have to worry about at this point, but down here, where there's absolutely no light, we have the darkest part, which is called either the dark accent or the shadow of occlusion. If my technical prowess will allow me, I will include a diagram of the order of light into the video, and you could look at that worked out. But this is the parts. We want to see how this plays out in here. Now, we're not concentrating on what happens in here, the transit into the light like that. I'm going to just very quickly say that what we would end up doing in here to render this white ball is putting in the tones here and creating a gradation and all kinds of stuff. But we're not going to do that today because it's too much information for one video. What we're going to do is just take the side of the pencil and put a gray tone in. I'm going to come back and talk about values in a second. Well, as I'm coloring in, I'll talk about values. Values are what we call the grays, what artists call the grays that tell us about how light or dark something is. Value is how much light is being reflected from a given surface. Hue is the color of the color. Value is how light or dark that color is in the light or not in the light. The value scale is typically marked out, though it's an infinity of tones, it's typically marked out in 11 stops. We can do drawings that use fewer values, and we can do drawings that have more than 10 values. But breaking it down into a set number helps us see and categorize and think about stuff more effectively. Middle gray is value 5, or it's the middle gray in between black and white. That's kind of what we're putting in here, something about middle to slightly more than that. Now, value is really hard. It's hard to see, it's hard to understand, it's hard to think about, it's hard to get it right. It's very relative because you can do lots of things with values. You can shift them this way and that way. But eventually you get to understand it. So let's come back in. Let's lift this out and see what we have here. For today's lesson, to get my point across, I'm going to say this should be the brightest white. So there's maximum light in it. That, of course, is not always true. So at this stage in the drawing, we'd want to correct our shapes, clarify them. We want to keep everything white. This can get very complicated as we start to think about color. So here, I'm not really considering color. I'm thinking of myself as a white plaster character. I should do that with the hair as well, but hair is usually darker than a light-skinned person's hair, light-skinned person's skin would be. So it creates a little bit of a confusion, but for right now, I'm still going to kind of go with this idea that if it's in the light, it stays white. Eventually, I would decide how dark the lit part should be versus how dark this lighter tone thing is. That's where it starts to get way more complicated. So we want to draw in all of those shapes. And I'm simplifying. This whole thing is called the block in. It's important in painting. It can be important in drawing, depending on how you draw. That little bit is in the light, and I couldn't get to it. I forgot to leave it out there. So what we want to do is just mark out all the shapes that are being hit by light and leave them white. As I said, we want to adjust, redraw these shapes. And it's going to look very much like your subject, as much as you can make it look like that, but it's just simplified. And it's kind of soft. Could be an end point for a drawing, if that's what you want. It's not unattractive. So we want to have the shadow put in, but we want to have enough white from the paper coming through it so that the shadow doesn't read as too dark, even though that reads as very dark. I may get this darker, but initially all I want to do is create kind of middle zone that tells me that in the white it's going to be lighter than this tone, and that anything that's darker is going to be inside those shapes. Now that's pretty much it for a block-in. I would, of course, do that in here as well. So you notice I'm putting these tones in evenly, kind of in one direction, so they don't get too heavy. Do you have to do it that way? No, but it's a good idea to learn that way. One aspect of a block-in that we can cover here is to think compositionally. So we know in this source material that everything back here is in shadow. So that's going to influence the way my drawing looks, because only my face will be in light. So once I get that head blocked in, and again, this is just a way of working. Some people would block all of this in right from the start. I don't think that would be productive for our lesson. Remember, what I'm looking for now is a little bit design and pattern. I'm not creating the illusion of three-dimensional form. That comes from rendering. That comes from putting all of the tones and the scale in. I'm looking for kind of a design. And how far I take this block in has to do with whatever I want. So I may say, well, there's really no distinction between the hair and the background, and really try to make that be the case in my block-in as well. So I can get this quite dark. Right now, basically everything is about the same value if it's in shadow, and the same value if it's in light. If I really want to add some more stuff to make myself feel good about, I can start to put in some places where it's a little bit, where it's darker. That almost kind of keys things a little bit and tells me that really dark things are going to be here and here and a couple of other places. But since I'm not really completely sure just yet, I don't want to start making things super dark or super black and then think, oh God, that looks terrible. Why'd you do that? So we're going to sneak up on the dark by building the relationships. And right now, we're just setting up our design. I think that's all I'm going to do for this, and then the next video we can pursue that. So let's clean this paper up a little bit, and let's talk about a value scale. We have white, of course, and at some point we need to establish how dark I can actually get, or what's going to be used to represent dark. In the middle, we need a tone that will feel as if it's kind of halfway in between. We want that to be light enough that I could put a tone in that's in between the two, and we want it to be dark enough that I can put a tone in between there, so that I have a highest light, a darkest dark, a shadow zone, and this gray along with this, mostly this, becomes my dark light. That's a 5-value system. You can do a drawing with 3 values as well. In each case, you're kind of simplifying the light. Even though this has got tons of values and it's lots of very nuanced, initially we want to break it down into simplified terms. So I know that in the light area, I'm going to have pretty much these tones. If I make a very nuanced, subtle drawing, maybe I'll figure out how to get more tones in here. I know that this tone is that, and that anywhere where it's darker is going to be this. And just to push this a little bit, let's say I know that there's some places where it'll get darker than that. And I'd want to just work this way to begin with. Each tone kind of working with the other tones to create a clear scale that convinces us about the way light is hitting this object, in which case sort of my head. That's it for today. I hope that makes some sense to you.